So this is the fifth in the series of, I think, 8 sessions on Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, and we are more or less just passing the midpoint of these presentations. So in a certain sense, we are now studying Joseph at the height of his career, which is 10 seconds after studying Joseph at the depths of his career. He's a man of ups and downs, shall we say.
He's bipolar.
Bipolar, perhaps. He's a bipolar life. But Joseph, at this point in our discussion, he has arrived. He has arrived. He is now a prince of Egypt. And that's an extraordinary change. He has gone through, he hasn't avoided, he hasn't gone around, he's gone through hell to get there. And just to pause and say, that is authentic biblical spirituality. That which distinguishes the Judeo-Christian spirituality from lots of other religions and lots of other philosophies. Lots of other philosophies are about avoiding troubles, escaping troubles, somehow winning the lottery ticket, not having to deal with the ups and downs of getting rich quick, finding Mr. Mrs. Right soon, etc. Not having these troubles. You can make a great profit on any religious setting if that's the kind of religion you're selling. As more than several people have repeated, no one ever lost $1 underestimating the tastes of Americans in religion. That is, Americans will buy it. If you promise them prosperity, you promise them happiness, you promise them success, you promise the avoidance of pain, and there they are. They'll line up to buy whatever coupon you are selling. But the great figures of the Bible, for what it's worth, and that therefore the foundation of our culture, are people who didn't escape, who didn't avoid, who went through the depths that someone like Joseph has gone through. He was favored, yes. He had assets, true. He was talented and handsome and beloved. But that was just, unfortunately for him, a setup. It was a setup. And I might suggest to you gently that the degree of the depth of sorrow into which he fell was greater because of the setup from which he started. If you think yourself beloved, feel yourself favored, if you know you have assets and they are recognized as high values, if that's where you started and then you ended up in a cistern and then you end up as a slave and then you ended up in prison falsely accused, and then you end up, by the way, we didn't much mention, but after you have done people favors in prison, you still end up 2 years neglected there in the abyss. That is to say, this is looking like my life, you might say. This is my, I've been here for years. That's going down. He went down. And that's in a setting such as we are, such as in a certain sense everybody is who's past the age of puberty. But in this setting where failure and dismissal and folly and mistake and trouble and reversal of some sort is the signature of everybody around. That's how we're here. We can't be pretentious here. And we're not. That's one of the jewels in the crown of a place like this. There's a certain warmth that we all should feel because of one way or the other, we're here because of something that didn't go quite right. And rather than denying it and pretending that it didn't happen, which is what the rest of the world is doing most of the time, we go, yeah, I'm here because I needed a second chance. Well, thanks be. That's a good thing to. I remember once I met it turned out to be eventually a very well accredited psychologist. He got his doctorate in psychology after the age of 40, however, because at the age of 30, his life collapsed badly, and to the point where he was institutionalized. And in the institution, an asylum for the mentally challenged, he was in an asylum for several years. But he said to me, coming out of that, that it's actually a very great liberation. But in that asylum, finally, there were no more pretenses. Everyone who was there knew they had come to their bottom. And finally, there was a great relief. No sense running around pretending like I'm on top of my form. I'm not. No sense pretending that I'm in charge of it all. I'm not. I'm a failure. And that there is a terrible thing, of course, in failing. But then there must be a relief. Or, as I like to fondly remember, I knew once a superior of a large monastery who told me, she was an abbess, I can't wait for the last judgment. Absolutely, Mother Abbess. The last judgment? You can't wait? Oh yeah. Living in community is nothing but a series of judgments all the time. There's nothing but a constant, it's like every day you're at an Olympic trial, people hold up numbers, 4, 5, 7, 6. The one from Russia holds up the number 9 because he's obviously lying, but everyone else is holding up 5 or 6 because you didn't do very well. Every day is a series of judgments. You walk past the cafeteria, and there's a whole table holding up little numbers. What kind of charade are you winning or losing today? Yeah, that's life. If you have a real job in the real world, well, that's they're holding up numbers every day, how you're doing. You have friends, you have enemies. They're all holding up, as it were, they're judging. So there's something to look forward to in a certain sense, that the last judgment is, the last one. That might be nice. Joseph has gone through a series of judgments, and he's failed. He's at the bottom. He hasn't avoided it. He's gone through it. And if he has any credentials for us, thousands of years later, to admire, it's not just that he was a bright, handsome, intelligent, favored. That's all good. But his real credential is he went down. He went down hard, and he went down again and again. And it's in that way that we can identify with him and he with us. All of his other assets notwithstanding, they're only worthy of our admiration because he was able to somehow rebound. What would we call that? Nowadays you would say he was resilient, or you would say, if you're a believer, he had grace. Whatever you want, whatever the card you want to describe, he rebounded. And the rebounding of that life, whether it be a foretaste of the resurrection, or whether it is a sign of grace, or whether it's the mystery of genius at the heart of creation, like a spark that can never be put out, whether it's the secret image and likeness of God that can never be completely eliminated, whatever the explanation, a force of vitalism in life that can never be completely quenched, whatever the explanation, you have to sit back and go, wow, when people rebound, that's wonderful. And for that reason, I thought Joseph would be a lovely figure for us to consider, a life on the rebound. So, he has gone through all these vicissitudes, all these failures, and he has come back. He did so because he had insight. In the end, it was a kind of a genius. He interpreted dreams. He interpreted dreams, and that's a wonderful skill. I know, as I said several times, and I'll repeat, I know a few psychologists, there are only a few, there are not many, who believe in dream interpretation as a key to unlock the soul. And I think there is something to it. People do have dreams. Now, not every dream is equally profound. When you're a teenager and you dream of dancing girls, it probably isn't a key to unlock the secrets of forever. But when you have certain dreams and you wonder, you scratch your head, what was that about? There's a dream you can't forget.
I dreamed I was flying.
Those are dreams which are revelatory.
It has to be upside down.
Now, clearly when people dream they are flying, they are on the rebound in their life.
Oh, really?
They're on the rebound.
Isn't that funny? Because here I am feeling good.
Sure. All dreams are to some extent revelatory of where you are, where you've come from, or where you're going.
Can I come to you with all my dreams?
Well, I'm a believer in dream interpretation on some level. I don't believe in the magic of dreams. but I do believe the dreams are revelatory of the soul. Joseph knew how to hear a dream and to interpret it. Now, that probably means that in spite of all of his blessings and in spite of all of his failures, he maintained a sense of the primacy of the other. He listened closely to whomever he was speaking. And he put aside his own troubles, and he put aside his own glory. He saw the other. When he heard the dream, he heard a soul, saw a soul, a heart, a life revealed. And he cherished it. He savored what he heard. He tasted it. He tested it in his own palate of his own imagination. And he spoke. And in that, what we would call it compassion, empathy, he spoke with grace, or he spoke with genius. And he was able to say what no one else could say. He was able to interpret dreams. We shall see how this works out. But it was that capacity to step outside of his own sorrows and to step outside of his own vanity and to let the other appear and to let the other be heard for himself that marked him as a prophet, that marked him as someone anointed, that marked him as someone special. Because I mind you, most of us, most of the time, can't get an inch outside of our own projections and our own needs and our own desires and our own fears. We just can't inch away. So when we're listening to someone else, we're really thinking, what am I going to say as soon as I can get him to shut up? What's my speech going to be whenever I can get her to be quiet? I'm preparing my talk. While you're blathering on, I'm not even listening. I'm pretending I'm catching 1/3 of what you say, and then I'm ready to burst forth with my insight, my enlightenment. But to sit back and let the other one speak at length, to let the other one tell you his dream, to pause and have nothing else in your heart and mind than the word, the depth of the heart the other one has revealed. That's an act of compassion or an act of spiritual genius that made Joseph, well, it made him a prince. And we would say that anyways. When someone ever listened to you very well, you've met a prince or a princess. Anyone who listens very, very well doesn't cloud up the audience with secondary thoughts and tertiary concerns and doesn't bother trying to correct you and interrupt you when you're speaking and finish the sentence before you do. Just really draws out. Well, you've met a prince. You have met nobility, maybe even royalty. And that's what they met. Even in the bottom of a pit or the basement of a prison, Joseph, he was shining in this remarkable way. The skill to listen with the ear of the heart, to listen closely to the dream of the other. That's a remarkable thing. And if we can afford that to anybody here or in our family, that is a well done day. 10 minutes of that is worth a week of the ordinary strategizing, of always topping whatever the other one is saying, and always being right, and always having the last word, etc., etc. It's very difficult to genuinely listen. It's the single greatest hospitality and probably the highest charity we can genuinely offer anyone in any given year of our life, is to listen closely, just for what they intend to dump, even if it's dumping. If that's what they need to do, to be the site of the dump, and then to clear through the dump and to find the jewel. This is what you meant to give me. It turned out they meant to dump, but you know what? There was still a jewel in there. So clear around here. This is what I heard. Wow. I've discovered it. You may have discovered it. If you want to win an argument, don't win the argument at the hour of the argument. Listen. Say to the other one at the end of the dump, whenever they've told you all their strong opinions, say thank you. Wow, you have a lot to say. And you really said it very well. I have a lot to listen to here. Thank you. I'm going to take that home with me for a while. You don't mind? We'll get back together some other time. You don't actually say, you idiot, you moron. That's the dumbest thing I ever know. Don't say anything like that. You say, wow, cool, that's amazing. You put a lot of thought into that. That's really profound. I never thought of that before. Go home
And then say what you
and maybe you did think of it, but you don't say that. Then the next day or 2 days later, whenever you meet them again, have another, and you know what you'll find? That person is a lot more receptive to an alternative opinion because he was heard. You listened. And now he can put down all the armaments, all the armor, all the spears and hooks and firearms and flamethrowers. He can put all that stuff down because you listened. So he's content now to listen back. But normally when we are having a little conflict, my armor versus your armor, my armament versus your... We all go home broken and wounded and nobody changed an opinion and everyone is alienated from each other. Joseph had that skill. So we were discussing the imprisonment of Joseph and the dreams that he interpreted of his fellow prisoners. One dream was a very favorable interpretation and had the import that the particular gentleman was going to go up, rising up from this prison into a much better life. And the other one was a tragic interpretation of a man who was about to be executed. To know how to interpret the signs of one's times, to know how to read the tea leaves of humanity, doesn't always mean to have good news. It's not always to be an optimist. But even when interpreting the one dream in the tragic way that it was to be fulfilled, Joseph did a favor to that man. Because if it was inexorable that he had only a few days more to live, a judgment was being leveled on him, wasn't it better that he knew that he could prepare himself for that transition which was to come? Prepare himself spiritually, emotionally, perhaps to prepare other people in his life, his family or friends. It's better to know than not to know. And so Joseph, by hearing that man's dream, listening to him intently, did him the favor of telling him the truth. In the other case, a man had a wonderful transition in his life. Joseph interpreted his dream. It was the dream which went as follows. In my dream, he said, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. It had barely budded when its blossoms came out, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. So I took the grapes, pressed them out into his cup, and put it into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph said to him, this is what the dream means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to his post. You will be handing Pharaoh his cup, as you formerly used to do when you were his cupbearer. So if you will still remember when all was well with you, that I was here with you, please do me the favor of mentioning me to Pharaoh to get me out of this place. The truth is, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and here I have not done anything for which I should have been put into a dungeon. According to the text, within 3 days, the man was in fact elevated out of the prison, was restored to a high post with Pharaoh, even higher than before perhaps. And then, true to human nature, the biblical text, Genesis, says, more or less, he promptly forgot the promise he had made to Joseph and did not remember him to Pharaoh. And Joseph languished further in prison. That must have been the low point of Joseph's life. Having been attentive, having been receptive, having been open, having borne no grudges, having tried to maintain a magnanimity of life, he was nevertheless neglected, forgotten, depressed, figuratively and factually in the prison of Egypt. But years later, or at least a long time later, 2 years it says, Pharaoh had a dream. Next chapter, chapter 41 in Genesis. And the dream of Pharaoh troubled him greatly, and his cupbearer realized that his boss was troubled, and then remembered Joseph. When Joseph became convenient, it was not for friendship, it wasn't for loyalty, it was for something to be useful that Joseph was remembered. And any reader of the text will catch this at once, and any I think, mindful person, any soulful person must realize, overwhelmingly this is life. Not so much friends and brethren, not so much parent and child, not so much spouse and love. Overwhelmingly, the driving force of social life is strategic and alliance. The man remembered Joseph when it was strategic to do so, and remembered him to Pharaoh to fulfill the promise that he had made to Joseph when it was to his advantage to remind him to Pharaoh. This is worthy to note, so that when this in fact is the case for the majority of our relationships, we shouldn't be so disappointed and certainly not embittered. Of course, it's not possible to have 900 friends on Facebook and really have 900 friends. It's not possible to have confidentialities with many people. If one has confidentiality genuinely with 2 people or 3 in a lifetime, you've done pretty well. The rest, let them be magnanimous, let them be fair, let them be just, charitable, civil. Let these relationships be fruitful. This is what Joseph would learn. No acrimony to the man who had let him languish in prison 2 long years. He came out and did the favor of interpreting yet another dream, the dream of Pharaoh. Pharaoh then had Joseph summoned. They hurriedly brought him from the dungeon. After he shaved and changed clothes, he came into Pharaoh's presence. Pharaoh then said to him, I had certain dreams that no one can interpret, but I hear it said of you that the moment you are told a dream, you can interpret it. Not I, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God, who will give Pharaoh the right answer. Pharaoh can't look at a filthy prisoner, someone who had been in chains, unshaven and poorly dressed. He must be shaved and changed. He must be given the appropriate makeover to be brought into Pharaoh's house. The higher one gets over an institution, or in this case a nation, the further one gets from the nitty-gritty truth of the people that are being governed. This often leads to disastrous consequences. When Tsar Nicholas would take his train from St. Petersburg to his villa in the Urals, crossing Russia by train, his aristocratic handlers had villages leveled along the way because they were unseeming. And instead they placed here and there papier-mâché outlines of fantastic skylines, of beautiful churches, lovely towns. And from a distance, the Tsar could look out the window and think, what a wonderful nation, empire I govern. Because he looked upon the good report, which was a false report. No wonder that Pharaoh cannot interpret his dreams. No wonder his dreams are troubling to him. He's not in touch with a very important part of his life, the realm he governs. He's not in touch with the troubles. And when difficulties would be presented to him, they make a makeover for that difficulty. Joseph, however, doesn't fall prey to the trap of this kind of aggrandizement for himself or for Pharaoh. He speaks straightforwardly. He says to Pharaoh, I do not have the power to interpret dreams as you might suggest, or has been suggested of me. It is given to me from beyond, from above, the power of dream interpretation, independent of whatever one's religion is or idea of spirituality. It's by and large essentially true that the greatest genius that human beings exhibit is hardly ever the result of their own perspiration. Overwhelmingly, the great writers, the great scientists, the great intellects of every age are visited by understandings and appreciations, insights that descend on them, and they say it. That's why the Greeks thought there were muses, little spirits who visited habitually certain people and made them genial. That's how our minds work, when they work well. But when we have to grind out solutions to our problems plottingly, step by step, typically our solutions are not very good and often fail. So Joseph has a certain humility for his genius and attributes it somehow to a spirit beyond him. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when up from the Nile came 7 cows, fat and well-formed. They grazed in the reed grass. Behind them came 7 other cows, scrawny, most ill-formed and gaunt. Never have I seen such ugly specimens as these in all the land of Egypt." Never have I seen such ugliness. Yes, because you're Pharaoh. You would only be shown the fat cow from the county fair, not the diseased cows of the poor farmer. But Pharaoh goes on. The gaunt, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows. But when they had consumed them, no one could tell that they had done so, because they looked as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In another dream, I saw 7 ears of grain, fat and healthy, growing on a single stalk. Behind them sprouted 7 ears of grain, shriveled and thin, and blasted by the east wind. And the 7 thin ears swallowed up the 7 healthy ears. I have spoken to the magicians, but none of them can give me an explanation. Joseph said to Pharaoh, "Both of Pharaoh's dreams have the same meaning." And any Jungian psychologist would nod his head approvingly of Joseph's immediate answer. Typically, when dreams come in a cluster, or at least in a pair, they are approaching the same truth from slightly different angles. In this case, it's not so different, the 2 angles, 7 cows or 7 grains. Most dreams have to do with the great transitions of life. We are yearning, groaning under the yoke of our mobility, the passage, the pilgrimage that we are always making. We would like to stay put when things are relatively well with us. We would like to make that child stay exactly that age when the child is sleeping. We would like to remain in this health or have this amount of security. We want to settle in to the best of times. But the stress is, deep down, we know we will not settle in. All of these things that we are glad to have are passing. Similarly, all the troubles that we are in are passing. Growing up, that process from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood is the paradigm of the rest of our life. When we are 80 and in our second childhood, we are in our second childhood. We are still hearkening back to the earliest years of duress and trauma, stress and reconciliation and conciliation. Everything that happens at our 20th, our 40th, our 80th year is a variation of what happened in our second and our third and our 4th year. When you look at a baby, you look at a toddler, and you see the range of emotions on the child's face, you shouldn't think, oh, that child is emotionally so different than I am. Every emotion that child has, and they come rapidly and they cascade and they're fierce and they're exhausting. Every one of those emotions are variations of emotions we are having in slower motion because we're not so strong as the child. We're not so resilient. If we had half of the emotions in a year that that child has in a day, would be institutionalized. If we fell down like that child falls down in the schoolyard, we'd be in a hospital for a month. The child screams and cries and gets up and starts playing again. The resilience of the child is an extraordinary thing. The child is going through difficult transitions, passages which are wrenching. And that's the pattern of our whole life. Our patterns are wrenching. And our dreams help us to cope with those patterns. Pharaoh identifies himself, and rightly so, with the whole land of Egypt. His nation, his empire, it is an empire, it's two kingdoms, the north and south of Egypt, are regarded as two separate peoples. His empire is an extension of his body. That's how many ancient peoples, traditional peoples, regard it. Arthur, King of England, is cited by the historians of yore as being the embodiment of the land. What happens to the land happens to Arthur. And, by the way, conversely, what happens to the king happens to his people. Centuries later, in the book of Exodus, we are told one day that the last and worst plague of Egypt was that all the firstborn of Egypt would die. From the house of Pharaoh all the way to the chambermaid. Every house would be visited with death, the death of the firstborn. There are not too many medical scenarios that could account for such a strategic strike, that only this particular kind of person would die, the firstborn son. Maybe it was a miraculous visitation of the angel of death, as it is described in the literature. But it could also be that if the firstborn of the house of Pharaoh died, and indeed, maybe this Pharaoh only had one son, a firstborn, that all of Egypt would suffer such a loss simultaneous. That every maid and maidservant, every lord and every aristocrat, every common laborer would suffer the same devastation. And so what happened to the king would happen to everyone. In this case, the inverse, what happens to everyone? A famine is coming. A terrible drought is coming. The cows are going to become thin and gaunt and ugly. The wheat is going to fail on the stalk. The farms are going to fail. The agricultural states will fail. Because it's happening to the land and Pharaoh dreams it. It happens to Pharaoh and he's troubled. And he wants to know what the dream means. It must be to be a father and a mother. Some similar things happen, that one identifies with the troubles of one's child. One lives vicariously. And that's quite a risky thing to do, to live vicariously through another. Joseph said to Pharaoh, both your dreams have the same meaning. God has foretold to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears are 7 years. It's a time span. It's a temporal dream of transition. The same in each dream. So also the 7 thin, ugly cows came up after them are 7 years. That 7 thin, wind-blasted ears are 7 years of famine. Just as I told Pharaoh, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but these will be followed by 7 years of famine, when all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. And when the famine has ravaged the land, no trace of that abundance will be found because of the famine that follows. So utterly severe that famine will be. Pharaoh had the same dream twice. It means that the matter has been reaffirmed and that God will bring it about. A famine in the land of Egypt means that the Nile River fails. Even 3,500 years ago, around this time, 4,000 years ago, this would not have been a result of the failure of rain in Egypt because there wasn't so much rain. But the failure of rain in Ethiopia would dry up the upper Nile, and that would mean that the Nile would not flood in its yearly cycle in the lower Nile in Egypt itself. And if the Nile did not flood, there would be no mud, there'd be no fertility. So he was anticipating that there was going to be a copious series of floods, followed by a lack of floods. According to the dream, the gaunt cows ate the fat cows, and they were still gaunt. The thin stalks of wheat ate the fat stalks of wheat, and they were still thin. That is to say, unless the dream wakes up Pharaoh to do something, the 7 disastrous years will erase the benefit of the 7 good years. That's probably a good idea when we are relatively young, and we don't want to study, and we don't want to discipline ourselves. But we have 7 good years, as it were. We have a period when we are strong and our minds are agile. And we ought not just to be allowed to play in some TV game where we are not responsive and not receptive and not engaged, but just passively pushing buttons and visually being stimulated without becoming a participant socially. Yeah, TV is a visual medium that makes us passive. Reading a book, by the way, is quite different. Reading a book engages the mind. We're actually talking to the author. The author could be dead 100 years or 1,000. But when we read a text which interests us, we are talking to the dead, and they're talking back. And it is a relationship, and we learn to love an author, and the author is loving us. And in that discourse of mutual regard, the mind comes alive. Synapses in the brain are starting to fire that hadn't fired before. And we wake up to truths about ourselves and about the world that we hadn't considered before. The 7 good years must be most advantageously grasped. They must be seized. The second chance, as it were, the dream affords, must be received for all it's worth, because following it is a challenge. The 7 good years can make the challenge bearable and can even help us not just survive the challenge, but in the case of Pharaoh and Egypt, help us to flourish through the challenge. So Joseph says, "Let Pharaoh seek out a wise and discerning man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Pharaoh should make a careful plan of action, appoint overseers, so as to regiment the land during the 7 years of abundance." Regiment the land, discipline the farming community. They should husband all the food of the coming good years, collecting the grain under Pharaoh's authority to be stored in towns for food. Thus, food will serve as a reserve for the country against the 7 years of famine that are to follow. This advice pleased Pharaoh and all his officials. "Could we find another one like him?" Pharaoh asked his official. That's what makes Pharaoh a good leader. And finally, instead of saying he didn't like Joseph for bringing him possibly bad news, or he didn't like Joseph because, after all, Joseph was outshining him in this moment, understanding what Pharaoh did not understand. Instead of despising him because he was a foreigner who didn't understand what his own officials were told, he could have said, "Put this man back in prison." He could have said, "Execute this proud man." Instead, he said, "Could I find another like him?" Which is the right question. There is no one like him in any given age. So Pharaoh elevated him. Pharaoh asked his officials, "A man so endowed with the Spirit of God, who is like him?" Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, no one can be as wise and discerning as you are. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people shall dart at your command. Only in respect to the throne shall I outrank you." Herewith Pharaoh told Joseph, "I place you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." With that, Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it on Joseph's finger. He had him dressed in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain about his neck. He then had him ride in the chariot of his vizier, and they shouted, "Abrek!" before him. Bow, bend low. It's a commonplace word throughout the Near East. No one even knows its origin. You could say it in Egypt, you could say it in Persia. You've said it before. A king or a noble would enter the house, abrek, bend low. Thus Joseph was installed over the whole land of Egypt. I, Pharaoh, proclaim, he told Joseph, that without your approval, no one shall move hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And then he gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of Heliopolis. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He put a robe on him, ring on, signs of authority. Not the first time that a robe was put on Joseph in recognition of his unique quality. His father had put a coat of many colors on him decades before. Cream rises to the top, no matter how long it takes. If there are certain qualities in a soul, they become apparent even in the most difficult circumstances. Other people must get lucky. But someone like Joseph, even in the midst of a series of the most unlucky circumstances, heaped on him by people who could not respect or admire him, he nevertheless rose back up to being favored, to being enrobed by someone who admired him. The greatest favor we can give someone, practically speaking, in life is to recognize their gifts and to enrobe them, to fashion them in our minds as the gifted people who are presented to us in our daily life. To live in the admiration of other people's skills and qualities is a fine way to live, and it's a fine blessing to give. Pharaoh, who was used to living pretty high and mighty himself, was able to grant it to another. And it is a blessing that any one of us could give anybody if they have admirable qualities. That is to say, as we mentioned before, if they can listen to them long enough to see the quality behind all the troubles that they are otherwise exhibiting. So Pharaoh hires Joseph for this position, makes him his vicar over Egypt, and he does exactly what he is asked to do. Joseph leaves Pharaoh's presence. He travels throughout the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, when the land produced abundant crops, he husbanded all the food of those years of plenty in the land of Egypt. And Egypt was enjoying it and stored up the abundance in their towns, placing each town the crops of the field around it. He made great granaries. Joseph garnered the grain in quantities like the sands of the sea, so vast that at last he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Yeah, the land of Egypt can do that in a very good flood. 1 acre of land of Egypt can produce almost the equivalent of 15 or 20 acres of land in the best farm countries in North America, because the silt is pure loam. No need to put any fertilizer. It is fertilizer. And in the constant sunshine of Egypt, without frosts, the growing seasons are continuous. There's no fallow field. There's no rotation of fields. Every field, from fence to fence, grows maximum yield. You have to get to hydroponic agriculture in the 21st century to do something like what Egypt's fields were able to do. And for 7 years, or that is to say, some significant period of time, the number 7 need not be understood here literally, but for some significant period of time, superabundance. So they could not even measure anymore the vast seas of grain. He husbanded the land. So a wonderful word. It's odd that this word becomes the word we use in marriage. Housebound. Husband. To be bound to the house, that is, to be bound to the welfare of the many, of the few in the case of a small house. To be bound to the welfare of the child, the spouse, the children. Housebound. Most men don't like to be housebound, but then they're miserable unless they become somebody's husband eventually. It's an interesting thing to be too much free is a kind of misery. To be too much bound, a kind of misery. But of the two, the husband, if he chooses his wife carefully, discerningly, and if his work, his discipline is effective, there is fruitfulness for everyone. 7 years of abundance, the people of Egypt enjoyed all that Joseph had done. And then it says, Before the famine set in, Joseph became the father of 2 sons. He named his firstborn Manasseh, meaning God made me forget. Manasseh, I forgot. God made me forget entirely the sufferings I had endured at the hand of my enemy. And the second son he named Ephraim, which means fruitful. God made me fruitful in the land of my afflictions. Manasseh and Ephraim, the 2 mentalities we must have simultaneously to face life at its best and its worst, at its feast and its famine. We must forget certain sufferings of the past, that is to say, not become bitter, not become resentful, not dwell on it, shall we say, not luxuriate in it, but transition away. And we must be grateful, Ephraim, for the fruitfulness of life that is still with us, or that we can hope for in the future. Joseph has, the power of positive thinking. He has a lot more than that, but there is a value to positive thinking, of letting go of that which is disintegrative of our present life. So the 2 names of Joseph's sons are representative of the 2 mentalities we must have simultaneously. We must be able to forget, that is to let go of the bitterness of the past, and we must be grateful, that is, we must be willing to be fruitful in the challenges of the present.